All right, my name is Eric Percy-Fine. I've been a physical therapist for 24 years now, and today I would like to explain and present to you the synaptic transmission process. As a quick review, we're going to turn on our laser pointer because we're going to use it throughout here. As a quick review, the cell, the neuron itself, has these little dendrites that are attached to the cell body, which is called the soma. There's an area here where electrical charge collects called the axon hillock. We'll talk more about it as we go. The axon is the long part of the neuron here that goes all the way along. These little greenish blue colored things are supposed to represent the myelin sheath, which is generated by Schwann cells. The spaces between the pieces of myelin are what we call the nodes of Ranvier. We'll talk a lot about those as we go along as well. As we reach the end, this is called the axon terminal, and where the axon terminal meets the next dendrite, we call the synapse. Again, as a quick review, the basic functions of the neuron are to receive signals or information, integrate incoming signals, and communicate those signals to their target cells, which may be other neurons, muscles, or glands, most commonly other neurons, as it turns out. More review, resting potential is the equilibrium at which the nerve is not conducting a message. So at rest, there's a certain concentration of sodium ions outside of the cell, a certain concentration of potassium ions inside of the cell. And if you don't know or don't remember, ions tend to move across gradients or cell membranes in some cases from high concentration to low concentration. They typically do so through ion channels. We will talk about some different ion channels as we go along today as well. And again, so you're aware, sodium is a positively charged ion, potassium a positively charged ion, chloride negatively charged anions, like our protein and amino acids are also negatively charged anions. So depolarization and hyperpolarization are important concepts to understand. We're going to talk about them a little bit as we go along here. But for illustration purposes, again, pretend this is a cell wall, phospholipid bilayer cell wall. Outside of the cell is extracellular fluid, extra meaning outside cellular fluid. There tends to be a high concentration of sodium outside of the cell, higher concentration of chloride atoms outside of the cell. Coincidentally, yes, that is salt, but don't think of it that way right now. Inside of the cell, in the cytoplasm or the cell fluid inside of the cell, there tends to be a higher concentration of potassium ions. This is an example of an ion channel. This one happens to look like it's for potassium to move out of the cell, but one way or the other, a stimulus has to happen to these ion channels to allow them to open and let either sodium in or potassium out, or even chloride in or chloride out. And that process of stimulation is called depolarization. On the other hand, hyperpolarization is the occurrence when and actually depolarization, just so you're aware, is when the inside of the cellular space becomes more positively charged than it is at rest. Hyperpolarization is when it becomes more negatively charged than when it is at rest. So we're going to illustrate this a little bit different of a way, okay? So pretend the dam here is a cell wall. And then there are these gates. You can see these gates over here on the right-hand side, but there are these gates that allow things to move in and out of the cell. So this space off to the right-hand side here, where there's a high concentration of water, think of that as sodium. And this is inside of the cell. There's a low concentration of water. Again, still think of that as sodium, right? And as I said before, ions like to move from high concentration to low concentration. So what has to happen here at a dam, for example, is a message has to come through to the boss, and it has to say, hey, we need to open up these gates. We need to allow some more of this sodium to flow in. Why? Well, because something exciting happened up here. In the case of a dam, maybe there was rainfall, a lot of rainfall, and there was some flooding, and it's moving down the river that this dam is pushing back against. This one happens to be the Colorado River. It's coming down. If we don't move some of it out, we're going to get flooding here too. So that stimulus comes in and it says, open up the channels. And so then we open up the channels, and then all of a sudden a bunch of water flows in, or sodium flows in to the intracellular space. So that's kind of a depolarization situation. Depolarization is not something that happens easily. For example, pretend that you are a neuron. You're at least the body of a neuron, right? So your body is the body. Your arms, your legs, hands, feet, head, tongue, eyes, everything are all dendrites, right? Those are your sensory input places. And I come along and I say, here, neuron, here's a piece of ice. Hold out your hand. I put that piece of ice in your hand. And you as a neuron say, all right, that's a little cold right in that little spot. But at the same time you say, well, but it's not that exciting. It's just a piece of ice, right? I can hold on to this until it melts. It might make a drippy mess, but it's really not that big of a deal. Now, still a neuron, but I plop you outside of a frozen tundra, or you're sitting on a floating iceberg, right? And now nothing but cold all around you, right? You're dressed just as you are right now, in fact. And so the wind is blowing and there's icy water around you and there's a bunch of ice around you, and you are going to shiver, right? Even if you're dressed really warm, you're probably going to shiver. Maybe your teeth are even chattering. Now you're really excited. Good or bad, you're really excited. Now, you as a neuron are depolarized. Hyperpolarization is kind of the opposite, right? So we're going to give you a different example. Say you drank a ton of caffeine in the morning, right? And most of us do, right? We're getting through college. But so we drink a ton of caffeine and it makes us really excited. Like we get to a certain point where like, I'm not even paying, I'm paying attention, now, and I'm almost even excited about this, but at some point that excitement starts to wane. And when it starts to go back down again, we actually call that repolarization. As we repolarize, sometimes we repolarize too much. So caffeine crash, right? So now not only do we not have caffeine in our body, but our body was so used to the amount we had, we're just like, oh, I need more. So we crash and we hit a really low point. That low point, that's hyperpolarization. It's below our resting level. All right. And then over time, at some point, everything kind of subsides and it comes back to what we call homeostasis, or normal resting potential. And that's really what's occurring. So from a more scientific point of view, right, here's the fun little graph, right? The cell tends to sit at somewhere around, say, -70 millivolts of electrical current inside of the cell. And say 55 millivolt, -55 millivolts is the minimum amount needed to depolarize, right? So here we are, happy little cell, little neuron, not feeling anything, and then some little stimulus comes in, and it's a little exciting. Then, oh, you know what? It's really exciting, and so we depolarize, right? We come up to this positive 30 millivolts all of a sudden. We're really, this is the caffeine kicking in, right? So we've hit the top of the curve. The caffeine is starting to wear off. We're starting to come back down to a normal level. We're not quite as excited. We're not talking as fast. We're not thinking as fast, whatever. That's repolarization occurring, right? And then we hit that caffeine crash. Oh, we got below. So below even that -70, we have hyperpolarized. And then over time, again, we come back up to our resting potential at that -70. If we're a cell, so quick little response here again. So for a cell, here's our soma, right? Here are dendrites. We've got some input coming into the dendrites. It causes a release of sodium into the soma. We talked about that through those ion channels. So this is an example ion channel. A stimulus comes in. These positively charged sodium ions get pulled into the inside, into the cytoplasm, so the intracellular space. And what then tends to happen is a lot of those are pushed along through the cell body, through the soma, toward this axon hillock right here. And they conglomerate at that axon hillock before they push into it. It takes just enough, right? So it's not just a little stimulus, it's a bigger stimulus. Enough of a stimulus has to happen to cause that axon hillock to allow the potential to move into the axon. Now, before we go into the axon, I want to talk a little bit about electricity and insulation. Think about electrical wires because it's the easiest and really very pertinent example here. We have bare wires that exist, right? We've all seen bare wires, and then we've also seen these that are covered in like a vinyl or a plastic, and those are insulated wires. Why do we have those? Well, so a bare wire will still conduct an electrical current, and it conducts it fairly effectively. But what happens with a bare wire is the electricity, because there's nothing holding it in, can actually leak out of that electrical wire. And that's why if the power is on, right, and you go over and you touch a bare wire, you get a little shock. It might make your hair stand up a little bit, right? That's because that wire is bare and the electrical current is leaking outside of that wire. If you get near a really high voltage power line, for example, sometimes you can actually feel like your hair on your arms or on your head might even stand up just a little bit also, just because there's enough of that electrical current that's leaking out of that wire. In an insulated wire situation, that doesn't happen, or at least not to the same extent. So the insulated wire keeps most of that electrical current within that wire. So it moves along without the loss of electrical charge, and it can be a little bit more efficient in that electrical transmission process. Nerves are relatively the same. So as an electrical current moves into an axon, and it has that myelin sheath, which is true in the peripheral nervous system, then it holds that electrical current in there so that it can move more efficiently along the axon itself. I mentioned that the sodium ions conglomerate together, right, in that axon hillock, and when enough of them get there, then they kind of finally move into the axon. That electrical current that allows that to happen is called electrotonic action. So it's based entirely on that electrical current, or enough electricity happening at that axon hillock that it says, okay, that's enough. We're going to go ahead and let you go into the axon here. So they push through that electrotonic action into the axon. As they start to move down the axon, then if enough of that electrical charge gets to a certain point, it hits another ion channel that allows more sodium to come in, and it boosts that energy along, and that happens at the nodes of run VA. But that additional pull in of electrical charges at that ion channel, that next ion channel, causes an action potential. So it boosts it along the way, and it makes it move a little bit faster. That now is an action potential. So we continue to add in additional sodium ions along the way. That is that addition and rapid change of voltage across the axon. That's called action potential. Think of this as, say, a running race. It could be a cycling race. It doesn't really matter. But some races have, a starting lineup where there's a bunch of really competitive athletes, right? And they're at that starting lineup. That's the axon hillock, right? And all of the racers, once they start that race, that number that they have just starting at the axon hillock or at the starting line, push through after the gunfires and they're really excited. They start going. That's electrotonic action, right? They're just right there and they're ready to go. And there's enough of them that the starting judge says, okay, well, let's go, guys. And so they run along, and at a certain point, say there's a fun run, that's added in here, or a few different distances of runs that other people have joined in. They get enough of them get past a certain point, and that next judge opens that next gate, right? That's that ion channel, and it increases the number of runners or ions now into the axon. So the raceway is the axon, and it swells it, right? And it pushes along a little bit faster because those first racers want to get out of the way of the new ones coming in, but they're also boosted by the energy of that new group of people coming in. And then along the way, it happens again and again until everybody has so much energy and they just keep pushing along, along the race course or the axon. They finally reach the end point. That again, that's action potential. From a neuron point of view, so this is a little bit more scientific way of putting it, right? So axon hillock is over here. Electrotonic action pushes the positive charged ions into the space. So this is all these sodium ions. They come along, they move through the axon. They've got this myelin sheath that's protecting it from leaking out. And then they get to this next gate, this node of Ranvier. There's another ion gate here that says, oh, enough of these runners, enough of these sodium ions have reached this spot. Boom, let's open the gate. And we're going to push it along even faster because now we've got more energy. So we're pushing it along. Next space comes along, myelin sheath keeps it all insulated. Next one, we hit, more energy is added, that next node of Ranvier, and it just keeps going like that along the axon. Again, that's how that action potential is amplified or swells along the way. Now, that process, that exists because there's an area of myelin and then a node, and an area of myelin and then a node, and it creates that quick movement in between. That is called saltatory conduction. Saltatory conduction has nothing to do with salt, even though sodium is involved, nothing to do with salt. It was originally derived from a Latin word, as so many things in medicine and science are. The Latin word is salire, which means to leap or to jump. And the first people that saw this happening, they thought, oh, what's actually happening here is it's leaping from place to place. It's not really, technically, it's just moving so fast in between the spaces that it seems to be leaping. But that input, push, input, push, input, push, that's saltatory conduction. To understand that maybe a little bit better, we're going to talk a little bit about waves, the physics of waves. So, because some people say, well, I mean, if the myelin is such a good thing, why don't we just keep, why isn't it all just insulated by the myelin all the way along the axon? Which makes a lot of sense, right? So just like the wire, if it's insulated, then the electrical current stays in there and it gets to the end, and it does, right? So even if the whole thing were insulated by myelin, it would still get to that endpoint the same way, but slower. And this is why, and so we'll explain it through waves, right? If you're at the beach and you're watching waves roll into the beach and you see small waves kind of come in and they're a little bit slow and they're moving along, but they'll still get to the beach on their own. But if you've ever paid attention, as a smaller wave meets up with another smaller wave, they swell, they become a little bit bigger. And when they get a little bit bigger, there's more water involved. It actually pushes a little bit faster. Now imagine adding a third or a fourth wave to it, and it gets bigger and bigger and moves even faster and faster toward its end point. That is the same, the compounding of waves makes bigger waves and makes them move faster. That's what's happening in saltatory conduction. We're adding more current, which creates a bigger electrical wave. And so as we continue to add that, it moves faster and faster along the axon to that axon terminal. As an aside, there are some demyelinating diseases, autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis, that can actually cause the wasting away of myelin within our bodies. And it usually happens peripheral, right? So out far, and then works its way, inward. And what it does is it slows down the connection along the way. So think again, if we go in and we strip away that insulator, the insulator's job is to hold the electrical current in. So even though we still have those nodes of Ranvier, theoretically, those additional ion channels, if we don't have the insulation, not enough of the electrical current actually reaches the node sometimes to cause that channel to open to add to the wave so that the electrical current doesn't always make it to the end. And unfortunately, what this ultimately does is it makes it to where patients that have this disease can no longer receive the full input all the way out to their extremities and even to other areas in their body progressively. And it makes it seem like there's no stimulation coming in at all. So far we have the soma, so we have the dendrites where a stimulation comes in, it pushes into the soma, it collects at the axon hillock, right? Moves into the axon, it's insulated by the myelin, it is boosted at the nodes of Ranvier, moves faster, 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 all the way along to the axon terminal. These little terminal buttons exist where a synapse occurs. The synapse is kind of a big deal, but again, and we're going to talk about it, but I want to just go through and define a couple of other things about this here. So that the neuron, we keep talking about this whole time, where the stimulation has come in and we've created an action potential. This is called the presynaptic cell. Pre meaning before. So it's the cell that is right before the synapse occurs. We have a synapse, that's the meeting space here where the terminal end meets the dendrite of the next neuron. That's the synapse. And then the neuron that's receiving the information is called the postsynaptic neuron. It's the after. So it's the neuron post meaning after. So on receiving after the synapse occurs. We're going to blow up the synapse a little bit bigger so that you can see it. The synapse is a structure, right, that permits the neurons to talk, to communicate with one another. There's a little space in between the neurons called the synaptic cleft. Okay, there are, of course, other ion channels in this area. This time it's for calcium, and if enough of a stimulation comes into that axon terminal, it tells these calcium channels now to open instead. And then these calcium channels will pull calcium into the environment. And then these little vacuoles here, or vesicles, that contain neurotransmitters interact with the calcium. And it gets kind of exciting. So we'll talk about neurotransmitters really quickly. Neurotransmitters there are different types, right? So there are different types of neurotransmitters in the body that cause different things to happen. So for example, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. And if your body is stimulated by something interesting, exciting, dopamine, which helps control your sense of pleasure, satisfaction, and motivation, will tell your body that you are experiencing something pleasurable, and it might make you smile or just make you happy inside. Another neurotransmitter on here that you see, serotonin, is involved in regulating things like mood and sleep and digestion, and bone health and even sexual desire. So as a part of mood, serotonin can affect depression. And a lot of people that have depression are treated with medications called SSRIs, or serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And those SSRIs work by blocking the reabsorption or reuptake of serotonin at that synaptic cleft. And so let's talk about that a little bit more. We'll go back to our synapse, right? So back to the synapse, when enough calcium enters this area, let's get the laser pointer going again here. It bonds to these little proteins that are sort of connected to the cell membrane called SNARE or SNAP receptor proteins, which grab onto these vesicles and pull them over to that phospholipid bilayer, that cell membrane, and that releases the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. That process is called exocytosis. As those neurotransmitters float across that synaptic cleft, then they bond to some ion channels on the postsynaptic neuron. And at that point, it causes either an excitatory postsynaptic potential, if it tells it to do something, to continue this message along the way, or an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, if it hyperpolarizes or tells it to kind of stop doing what it's doing. Going back in here, I said that if this were serotonin, for example, it might get after that synaptic potential occurs, then the body will either reuptake that neurotransmitter back into the prior one, or it'll just dissipate on its own. But SSRIs, remember that serotonin reuptake inhibitor, it blocks the body from being able to reabsorb that serotonin. So more of it sits in there. And while some of it is just going to dissipate on its own, some of it is going to continue to stimulate that postsynaptic neuron. So let's go through the synaptic transmission one more time. Okay, so we have the information coming in to the cell at the dendrites. It stimulates the cell, collects a bunch of sodium ions in the cell body. Those sodium ions pull into that axon hillock, the starting line of the race, right? The electrotonic action, if enough of them collect, the electrotonic action allows them to push into the axon along the race course. They get to the myelin, they're insulated, they're protected from leaking outside of the cell. So they're moving along just fine. And then they get to that node of run VA. More ion channels open, allow a bigger wave to occur, pushes a little bit faster. The next one comes along a little faster, a little faster, a little faster, until we get all the way to the end of that axon, to the axon terminal, to those little buttons that occur at the presynaptic area. And now we boost back over here. Presynaptic neuron has these neurotransmitters encapsulated in these vesicles or vacuoles. The calcium ions are pulled in because there's enough of a charge. That SNARE protein or SNAP receptor pulls that vesicle over to the cell membrane, opens it up, right? Exocytosis occurs, opens it up, allows the neurotransmitter to move into the synaptic cleft, bond to the postsynaptic neuron, and get pulled in and create that excitatory or inhibitory postsynaptic response. And that is synaptic transmission. Now, just again, one more side note. There are some risks and benefits to neurotransmitters that humans have put into, and nature have put into action. So, for example, a neurotoxin can be a synthetic or a naturally occurring substance that can impair, damage, or destroy the central and/or peripheral nervous systems. Some examples include snake venom, right? So here's my rattlesnake, botulinum toxin or Botox. But it also can include pesticides, heroin, cocaine, lead, ethanol. All of those are technically neurotoxins. Neurotoxins have side effects, right? So they can cause things like paralysis, weakness, numbness, tingling, headache, vision loss, behavioral problems. But despite their destructive nature, the benefit to having learned about neurotoxins, it helps us discover what our nervous system does. So if we, for example, when we use botulinum toxin or Botox, we know that it decreases muscle activity. And so for a side effect, positively in this case, sometimes we use Botox to help decrease severe muscle tension that can cause headaches. Or on a more cosmetic level, sometimes we use Botox to help just decrease wrinkles. But overall, that is my presentation on synaptic transmission. I do appreciate the opportunity to have shared this with you. Please let me know if you have any questions.